was the largest ship to ever sink in the Great Lakes. Resting place is now 530 feet below the lake's surface, allowing only experienced divers with expensive submersible vehicles to visit her.
530 feet down, in water just above freezing, a new underwater robot approached the mangled hull of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. Its mission, to solve a 50-year-old mystery. But when the high-powered lights hit the deck, the engineering team saw something that terrified them. A fatal flaw, missed by every previous dive, was staring right at them. This new evidence proves the 29 men on board never stood a chance, and the ship's end was far more sinister than anyone dared to imagine. Piercing the 50-year darkness before dawn, a specialized research vessel hovered in place, its global positioning system locking it directly above a lonely point on Lake Superior's icy surface. This was the known resting place of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. Nearly 50 years had passed since the freighter vanished, but the wreck remained an untouched memorial, lying 530 feet below in black, near-freezing water. Let's put that depth into perspective. 530 feet is the equivalent of a 50-story skyscraper. The pressure at that depth is over 230 pounds per square inch, enough to crush most conventional equipment. The water temperature hovers at a life-ending 39 degrees Fahrenheit all year round. Down here, there is zero sunlight. It is a world of absolute blackness, total silence, and for decades, no real answers. But this time, things were different. A new generation of investigators was prepared to make contact once more, armed with cutting-edge underwater drone technology that didn't exist even 10 years ago. The remotely operated vehicle, or ROV, was a marvel of modern engineering, a far cry from the grainy, tethered cameras of the 1980s and 90s. This machine was not just a camera, it was a subaquatic detective. It was outfitted with 6 high-powered cinema-grade floodlights, capable of turning the pitch-black darkness into day. It had 4K resolution cameras, advanced multi-beam sonar, and, most importantly, AI-assisted scanning systems. The thing nobody tells you about this new tech is that the AI can detect structural anomalies, like stress fractures or missing rivets, that a human eye, even a trained one, might miss in the silt-covered gloom. Engineers on board describe the drone as surgical. Its 10 specialized thrusters were calibrated for ultra-slow, quiet movement, essential for navigating a fragile wreck site without disturbing the half-century of sediment that cloaks the entire scene. A wrong move could cloud the water for hours, ruining the investigation. Its high-dexterity manipulators could, if needed, retrieve an object no larger than a coin. Most importantly, it could generate detailed, millimeter-accurate, 3-dimensional digital models of everything it saw in real time. This was not an exploration, it was a forensic investigation. As the ROV slipped into the dark water, the surface was deceptively calm, a chilling contrast to the roaring storm that claimed the Fitzgerald decades prior. Inside the vessel's control room, operators sat in the glow of their monitors. They watched their screens as the drone sank slowly, its fiber optic tether unspooling, a lonely lifeline to the world above. The first 500 feet were just a descent through murky, dark water filled with ghostly outlines of sediment. And then, structure. A mammoth steel form began to emerge from the gloom. "There she is," one operator breathed. The bow of the Edmund Fitzgerald stood eerily upright, buried deep in the lakebed, looming like a cathedral wall. The red-hued hull, now a dull, ghostly rust, was coated in decades of silt and invasive zebra mussels. Fish darted across the screen, moving slowly in the frigid cold. The drone circled, its powerful lights cutting through the darkness. The team saw the twisted stern section lying inverted and mangled a short distance away. They saw the torn open cargo hatches and the battered superstructure, but what shocked the team was not the violence of the wreck. It was how silent and calm everything appeared. The Fitzgerald showed no external signs of a massive explosion or a catastrophic fire. It gave the impression of an object that had simply come to rest, almost peacefully. And that, to put it mildly, was the most terrifying part. Somewhere in that stillness lay the truth of how 29 men disappeared in an instant, without a single distress call. The drone team began their pre-planned survey, concentrating on the forward deck, where the cargo holds were. The images they captured were beyond compare. millimeter-level resolution in total darkness. They could see every rivet, every gash, every scrap of peeling paint. The AI began mapping the hull, its processors cross-referencing the ship's original blueprints with the damage it was seeing. And that's when one of the engineers leaned in, his eyes fixed on the foremost cargo hatch. "Back it up 3 feet," he instructed. "Hold there. Zoom on target 4 Alpha." The drone operator complied. What the 4K camera showed next forced a heavy, cold silence across the control room. A clamp was missing. You see, the massive steel hatch covers, the only thing protecting the 26,000-ton cargo of iron ore from the lake, were supposed to be sealed shut by 22 heavy-duty steel clamps each. These weren't just simple latches. They were massive, hand-cranked fixtures, the core of the ship's watertight integrity. If they failed, waves could smash open the covers, allowing thousands of gallons of water to gush directly into the cargo hold. This clamp hadn't just corroded away. It was gone. The steel around its mounting point was bent. The drone moved to the next hatch, then the next. A horrifying pattern emerged. Again and again, the drone's lights exposed bent, damaged, or entirely absent clamps. Some looked as if they had been violently torn off. Others were twisted backward, clearly subjected to an intense, repeated stress that steel was never meant to endure. This was not a single, localized failure. It was widespread. It was a systemic breakdown. But then, the cameras caught the real wow factor, the detail that would shift the entire investigation from a historical mystery to a modern-day warning. It was an air vent pipe on the forward hatch. It was supposed to be a tall, sturdy structure. Instead, the drone's camera showed it was completely sheared off at its base, leaving an open, gaping steel ring leading directly into the cargo hold. This wasn't slow, corrosive wear. This was a violent break. This vent, a simple part for air circulation, had become a direct 4-inch wide funnel for the frozen raging lake. An engineer did the math on the spot. A 4-inch hole under the pressure of 35-foot waves would act like a high-pressure fire hose. This was the evidence that terrified the experts. This was the smoking gun. This horrifying evidence solved the mystery, but it made no sense without knowing the story of the ship's final, silent moments. The storm of the century. To understand why that sheared vent and those missing clamps mattered so much, you have to go back to November 10th, 1975. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald was pushing through the heart of Lake Superior, fully loaded with over 26,000 tons of taconite iron ore pellets. She was fighting to reach the safety of Whitefish Bay. But why was she out there at all? The thing nobody tells you is that the weather forecast for that day was bad, but not apocalyptic. It called for a storm, but it was a storm these veteran crews had seen and beaten 100 times before. Shipping on the Great Lakes is a business of tight margins and tighter schedules. Delaying for a storm was a last resort. So, Captain Ernest McSorley, seasoned and calm, made the call to go. He wasn't alone. Several miles behind her, the freighter Arthur M. Anderson was tracking her on radar, both ships battling a storm that was growing more violent by the hour. What began as a typical November squall had turned, as the lake captains say, into a November witch. Believe it or not, a November witch is a specific, terrifying weather phenomenon unique to the Great Lakes. It's a low-pressure system created by the collision of cold, dry Arctic air from the north with warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico, all supercharged by the still warm waters of the lakes. The result isn't just a storm. It's a cyclone. By the afternoon of November 10th, this was a full-blown maritime nightmare. Winds surged past 70 miles per hour. That's hurricane force. Ice pellets and snow whipped through the air, reducing visibility to almost zero. But the real problem was the waves. The lake, churned by the winds, was producing confused seas, where waves come from multiple directions. And these waves were recorded at a staggering 35 feet. Imagine a wall of water taller than a 3-story building, moving at highway speed, smashing down on the deck. The captain of the Fitzgerald, Ernest McSorley, remained in regular radio contact with the Anderson. But by the afternoon, the Fitzgerald was clearly in trouble. Around 3:30 p.m., Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson with a troubling and fateful update. "We have a bad list," he said, meaning the ship was tilting to one side. "Lost event. One of the hatch covers is giving us trouble. You see that lost vent he mentioned? That was the gaping 4-inch wide hole the drone just found. The hatch cover giving us trouble? That was the beginning of the catastrophic clamp failures. Despite this, McSorley sounded composed. He emphasized that the situation was under control. His tone was steady, his voice calm, but the tempest was relentless. At 7:10 p.m., the Anderson radioed the Fitzgerald one last time to check on their status. Captain McSorley's final words crackled over the radio. "We are holding our own." That was all. There was no note of desperation, no panic. Then, silence. Moments later, the radar screen on the Anderson showed a blank void. The once mighty Fitzgerald, which had been steady on its course just minutes before, completely vanished. Not a single distress flare was launched. There was not one mayday call. The ship and all 29 men on board simply faded from existence. The Coast Guard was informed immediately, and a massive search operation began. But there was nothing to find, just small bits of debris and some oil slicks. Eventually, the wreckage was located, split in two, 530 feet down. The bow section sat upright in the mud. The twisted stern lay upside down a short distance away. For nearly 50 years, the very knowledge of the wreck only raised more questions. How could a vessel this large, this powerful, collapse in just a few minutes without anyone having time to even grab a life jacket or send an SOS? What many overlooked for years was the simplicity of the clues. The official United States Coast Guard report in 1977 concluded the most probable cause was the flooding of the holds through hatch covers that were not properly secured. The families of the crew were outraged. To them, this theory blamed the men. It suggested Captain McSorley and his crew were negligent, that they didn't do their jobs. It felt like a betrayal. The Lake Carriers Association, which represented the shipping companies, fired back with its own theory. They claimed the ship must have struck an uncharted shoal or reef near Caribou Island, gashing its hull open. Another theory was a catastrophic structural failure, that the ship simply snapped in half on the surface under the stress of the 35-foot waves. But with no survivors and only grainy, limited footage from early dives, the truth remained buried. The silence of the ship's last moments became its legend. You see, these theories were just talk. But what made this ship so special and its loss so shocking in the first place? Pride of the American side. When the SS Edmund Fitzgerald slid into the waters of River Rouge, Michigan in 1958, she wasn't just another freighter. She was a floating marvel. Over 20,000 people gathered for her launch. She was, at the time, the largest vessel ever built to navigate the Great Lakes. At 729 feet long, she was longer than 2.5 football fields. She was, quite literally, the Queen of the Lakes. And here's a wow factor for you. She was named after a real person. Edmund Fitzgerald was the president of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, the company that financed the ship's $1 million construction. It was a floating monument to his success. Her purpose was simple: to be a workhorse. She was built to transport vast quantities of taconite iron ore from the mines near Duluth, Minnesota, to the steel mills in Detroit and Toledo. And she was good at her job. The Fitzgerald could load over 26,000 tons of ore per trip. But the ship quickly became more than just a hauler. She became a symbol. She was a true beauty. Her sleek white superstructure and gleaming burgundy hull turned heads. Families would gather at the Sulaks just to watch the Big Fitz pass. Her deep 3-blast horn would echo like a ghostly call across the water. Tourists took pictures. Children in port towns knew her name. Among the crews, she was referred to fondly as the pride of the American side. It wasn't just her size that made her iconic. It was the loyalty she inspired. Life on these freighters was tough, but the Fitz was known as a Cadillac of the fleet. She had amenities other ships lacked, like comfortable quarters and a well-stocked galley. Captain Ernest McSorley, who was in command on her last voyage, was one of the most seasoned men on the Great Lakes, with 44 years of experience. He believed in the Fitzgerald. He trusted her strength, and so did his men. But here's the kicker. The Great Lakes are not easy on ships. The weather can change in an instant. Ice, fog, and violent storms are constant companions. Yet for 17 years, the Fitzgerald carried on, seemingly brushing aside the fury of the lakes. She set multiple records for carrying the most cargo in a single season. By 1975, she was one of the most respected freighters afloat. She had a rock-solid reputation. Believe it or not, in the eyes of many, she was considered unsinkable, a term that history has seldom treated kindly. But not all things are what they seem. The thing nobody tells you is that the unsinkable myth was already starting to show cracks. The Fitzgerald was not an old ship, but she had been run hard. In 1969, she grounded near the Sulaks, suffering significant hull damage. In 1970, she collided with another freighter. Both times, she was repaired and sent back to work. But these incidents show that she was not invincible. She was a steel workhorse, and the work was taking its toll. When she loaded up with iron ore pellets on November 9, 1975, it was just another run, another shipment, another storm. But unbeknownst to the crew, the forces of Lake Superior were brewing one of the worst outbursts on record, and the Fitzgerald, the pride of the American side, was sailing directly into it. She was the queen of the lakes, so why did the brand new drone footage prove she was a ticking time bomb? Drowning in silence. The underwater drone's footage didn't just confirm suspicions, it shook the maritime world to its core. Engineers, historians, and shipbuilders who reviewed the findings weren't just fascinated. They were, to put it mildly, disturbed, because what the 4K images showed wasn't just how the SS Edmund Fitzgerald sank. It was a blueprint for how any vessel of its era could fail, quietly, invisibly, and fatally. To the untrained eye, a few missing clamps or a shattered air vent might look like minor storm damage, but to a naval architect, these were critical failure points. Those 462 clamps were the only barrier between the raging lake and the massive cargo holds. The discovery that many were missing, bent, or fractured meant water had free access. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. The thing that horrifies experts is that this vulnerability went completely unnoticed by the crew. There were no panic signals, no emergency flares. Captain McSorley's last message, "We are holding our own," wasn't an act of bravado. It was, in his mind, a genuine rational belief. They, quite simply, did not know they were sinking. A naval architect who analyzed the new ROV footage said it plainly. This wasn't a ship breaking apart. This was a ship slowly drowning. The horror is in the silence. The new evidence allows us to piece together the Fitzgerald's final, terrifying moments. That lost vent McSorley reported, that was the 4-inch hole the drone found. In a 35-foot sea, that hole was acting like a high-pressure hose, funneling thousands of gallons of water per minute directly into the bow. This water, weighing thousands of pounds, was pulling the front of the ship down, causing the bad list, McSorley reported. The crew stationed in the pilot house all the way at the stern, the back of the ship, was likely unaware of the rate of the flooding. They were still at full speed, trying to outrun the storm, not realizing that the bow of their own ship was already slipping beneath the waves. Here's the most chilling wow factor, the physics of the final moment. As the bow sank deeper, the stern, where the massive engines were, was still being pushed forward. The ship was, in effect, driving itself underwater, like a submarine in a power dive. The crew in the pilot house would have felt a sudden, violent lurch as the bow hit bottom 530 feet down, while the stern was still on the surface. This catastrophic torque is what snapped the 700-foot ship in two. The crew had no time to react. The high-definition drone footage finally silences the whispers and what-ifs. It methodically debunks every other theory that has swirled for decades. It wasn't a shoal. The hull is scarred, but it shows no catastrophic gash marks from a reef. The ship wasn't ripped open from below. It wasn't one single monstrous rogue wave. The damage is systemic, a brutal progressive failure. This was a death by 1,000 cuts, the result of hours of relentless pounding in a hurricane-force storm. But most importantly, the footage finally debunks the human error theory that has haunted the crew's families. The painful narrative that the crew was negligent, that they simply forgot to clamp the hatches, is shattered. The new footage is chillingly clear. The clamps were secured, but they are twisted, torn, and ripped from their moorings. They didn't just fail, they were annihilated under stress that the design never anticipated. The design itself, not the men, was the problem. The Fitzgerald, once considered the cutting-edge Queen of the Lakes in 1958, had not evolved. It was a relic operating in a modern, unforgiving world. It had no modern flood detection systems in its cavernous cargo hold. No double hull barriers. Its entire survival depended on those 1950s era clamps holding back the fury of Lake Superior. In the face of a November witch, a storm of almost supernatural ferocity, that was nothing but wishful thinking. The ship was taking on water for hours, and the crew likely never even knew until it was far too late. This disaster sent shockwaves through the entire maritime industry. The wow factor isn't just the sinking, it's that the Fitzgerald's tragic end became a brutal, non-negotiable catalyst for change. It forced a reckoning. Today, all Great Lakes freighters are required to carry thermal survival suits for every single crew member, a direct response to the Fitzgerald's lost crew. GPS systems and emergency locators became mandatory. Most critically, hatch and vent designs were completely overhauled, built to withstand forces the Fitzgerald's designers never dreamed of. Inspections became far more stringent. The ship didn't just sink, it was doomed by silence. The silence of a cargo hold slowly filling, unheard by the crew. It was doomed by age and by the lethal assumptions of a bygone era. And the most chilling part of all, no one saw it coming. The drone solved the mystery, but it opens a new one. Were other ships from that time just as flawed? Let us know what you think. Like and subscribe for more hidden truths.